Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
Our next guest, well, our first guest today is an old pal of mine. He's been talking to me on telly and radio for a number of years now. I'm very fond of him. He's a legendary human rights campaigner for 50 years or more than 50 years now. He's been fighting for the rights of people around the world, no matter where they are in the world, no matter how they're being abused or put down or discriminated against. He's there fighting their cause. It's a real pleasure to welcome back to the show our friend Peter Tatchell. Peter, welcome back. How are you?
Terrific. Lovely to hear from you. It's been too long, but I'm glad we're meeting up in 2016.
Thanks, Peter. It has been too long. It's been about 8 or 9 months since we last spoke. And I jumped all over something because I get your briefings and your press releases along with many hundreds and thousands of other journalists. And I was very interested today because this week I've been talking a lot about, heavier stuff to do with politics, to do with the situation in Syria, Saudi Arabia and so on. I was really, and of course you have opinions on these things, very interested to read your thoughts on zoos and animals being imprisoned in zoos. I'm first of all going to confess, by the way, that a few months ago, looking for something to do on a Saturday, I did take my betrothed, the future Mrs. Allen, I took her to Chester Zoo, Peter. Mm-hmm. And we went there. It wasn't the greatest visit now that we ever had in our lives. We went around, we looked at all of these animals. We were told about these conservation programs and what the zoo was doing to help conservation in the wild and all of that. But I'm going to be honest, it did occur to us that it was kind of sad to see some of these magnificent animals basically in pretty tiny enclosures. And we came away, I think, a tad depressed. Tell us about your taking up this cause. Why this cause? Why today for this?
Well, of course, many people will say, Peter Tatchell, you are a human rights campaigner. What's animal rights got to do with it? Well, my response is human rights and animal rights are two sides of the same coin. They're both about welfare and prevention of suffering. So when we champion human rights, we are championing the rights of human animals, because we too, as humans, we are an animal species. When we champion animal rights, we are championing the rights of other species. But we are all part of the same continuous animal kingdom. And to me, the prevention of suffering by any sentient being is a very fundamental, important right, very important moral and ethical value. So when I see animals suffering, I'm conscious that we now know, thanks to scientific research, that animals share many, many human characteristics to varying degrees. There's no, sharp break between animals and humans. It is part of a continuum. And other animals share, to varying degrees, many human traits like intelligence, language, sociability, and emotion. Animals can feel the difference between pleasure and pain. Many of them, particularly the higher mammals and vertebrates, have emotions like sadness, boredom, loneliness, stress, and depression, which is analogous, not exactly the same, but analogous to what we humans experience. And you can see that in the faces and the behavior of many animals kept in zoos. The relentless pacing up and down of wolves or lions or tigers or leopards, that is a stress reaction to confinement. So to me, defending the rights of animal species other than our own is part of the same equation that motivates my defense and support for human rights for human animals.
Well, I was when I was reading your press release today, I was reminded of that truly heartbreaking documentary called Blackfish, which was about killer whales in captivity, and the way the filmmakers, who obviously were very subjective, they were strongly opposed to the captivity of killer whales, but the way they were able to prove, I think beyond a doubt, the intelligence of the creature, how incredibly bright they were, and how they were slowly but surely basically going insane because of the conditions under which they were kept. And I resolved at the time, Peter, I said to myself, well, I never have been to one of these SeaWorld type places. They don't really exist as such in the UK as they do in some places in Europe, but I could never go anywhere near one of those places. I'll talk to you about parents in a minute and children and the excitement that children have when they see these animals. But speak first to, because zoos and some zoologists will say, well, you know, Peter Tatchell, it's all very well for him to say this, but a lot of zoos are doing a lot of good because they're working with endangered species to help, first of all, to raise awareness about animals that are endangered in the wild. But breeding programs that take place at zoos are often funded by the punter coming through the gates of the zoo and spending his or her money. How do you respond to that?
Well, of course, zoos and conservation are two very different objectives. There may be some overlap, or maybe potentially some overlap, but essentially conservation, which is wholly commendable and I applaud and give my full support for, it's very different from zoos, which are basically about putting animals on display for the pleasure and entertainment of human visitors. Conservation is something very different. It's about breeding programs and other initiatives designed to save threatened and endangered species. Now, that is increasingly the justification that zoos are using for their existence. They say, we're in the business of conservation. This is our justification. But the Born Free Foundation did a big research project looking at London Zoo and the other zoos in the consortium of charitable zoos in the UK, and they found that these zoos, between all of them, the collective zoos of Britain, housed samples of only 8% of endangered mammals, just over 5% of threatened birds, a mere 11 of over 1,800 at-risk amphibians, and only 3.5% of animals on the red list of threatened species. Now, I think that's a pretty poor record of conservation by zoos who claim to be working for animal conservation.
Yeah, I think if those figures are right.
If conservation is going to take place, it's best if it takes place in the animal's country of origin, where they can exist in a terrain, a geography, vegetation and climate that is their natural habitat.
Loads of tweets, Peter. Can I just jump in? Loads of tweets. David on Twitter says it's wrong and distressing to view majestic animals like tigers and bears pacing back and forth in zoos. Phil was on to say, great apes in the zoo, gorillas. Look into their eyes and you see the truth. It's prison to them. Loads and loads of similar tweets about that. Nobody's disagreeing with that. Paul was on to say, good question, Paul. What is Peter's view on safari parks then? There's a really good one in Knowsley, about 2 miles away from me. It's great. Safari parks, Peter, what do you think? They're bigger, there's much more room for the animals, or is it the same thing?
No, there's quite clearly a big difference between a safari park and a zoo enclosure, which is a very small confined space. No doubt about it. I think there is a case for good quality, large safari parks where animals are living in environments that are very close to the kind of environment they would live in the wild. I remember some years ago seeing a film, it may have been by Animal Defenders International, which showed lions released from captivity in zoos. And the initial film was about their life in the zoo and, the confined space, the pacing up and down. And then you saw them being released into the wild, and their instinct was to run and leap and roll. It was just like a human being being released from imprisonment.
Yeah.
They just grew into their own natural instinctive behavior, which had been suppressed during their life in the zoo. London Zoo, for example, you look at the enclosures for zebras, camels, and giraffes. They're not really, really tiny, but they're not big. and they're very barren, a lot of barren earth around. Certainly not enough room for them to wander as they would in the wild. They're not housed in large family groups like they would be in the wild. You look at the gorilla kingdom enclosure. Previously the gorillas were held in cages. Now the new enclosure is much better, but it's not the gorilla's natural rainforest habitat. In fact, it's not even forest at all. It's an open plan enclosure, which is not made for the interest and welfare of the gorillas, but so that the public can clearly see them, so they can't hide away. So I think, even the goodest or the best initiatives leave a lot to be desired.
No doubt about it. Peter Tatchell is our guest this hour. We've got Peter for another 10 minutes or thereabouts. Thanks for all your tweets. Loads on this, but I do want to talk about Saudi Arabia in a second. There was a very interesting question from Martin Noakes, who's a big fan of yours, Peter. And you met Martin, and when you came to see us at TPV in London a few years ago, you met Martin. And Martin that's an interesting question about the promotion of homosexuality and transgenderism in schools. Now, I don't know anything about that, but he's asked, I'll get to that in a second maybe. It's an interesting question. You might have a point on it. Shona Dryden says, and a lot of our listeners, Peter, understandably, and I know this because I speak to them all the time, are indeed vegetarians. And Shona has been on to say, what about the poor animals that are eaten? The conditions they're kept in around the world are absolutely shocking, she says, and she's right to make that point as well. Loads of questions about this. Nobody seems to be in favour of zoos. One or two people saying that even the safari parks sometimes have a lot or leave a lot to be desired. Just before we talk about and Saudi Arabia, and you've quite rightly had a lot to say, and I was delighted, by the way, to see you on the Murnahan show on Sky News a couple of Sundays ago. Thrilled that finally one of the mainstream news organisations allowed a human rights campaigner on to talk about the brutality of Saudi Arabia. We'll get to that in a second. But speak to that question about primary schools and secondary schools. Do you think there's this is completely new to me. I'm not in any way. This just came in on Twitter, and anybody who wants can read it on Twitter there. Do you think there is an overemphasis on talking about homosexuality and transgenderism in primary schools and secondary schools? What do you think?
Well, not that I've heard of.
Yeah, me neither.
It's true that increasingly schools will reference same-sex relationships in an age-appropriate way. It's not about promoting or encouraging homosexuality. It's about combating prejudice and the bullying that the vast majority of lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender kids experience in the classroom and in the school playground. Over 50% of young LGBT kids say that they were bullied at school because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. Now, the education programs at schools is designed purely to stop that bullying, to promote understanding and tolerance, in the same way that schools also try to combat racism and to promote racial harmony and understanding.
Can I jump in there? Because I agree with you. Look, I went to school like everybody else, and I was in high school 20 years ago, and when a child was labelled as gay, whether he or she was or wasn't, the nonsense they had to put up with was terrible. And you and I, Peter, going back years, spoke about your own experiences in the 70s and 80s when it wasn't so cool to be gay, when terrible things happened to gay men and women, abuse, violence. We know that. What about that story in the Daily Mail this week that said 10 children a week are being excluded from schools because of racism? Now, Peter, nobody wants to tolerate racism or abuse of any child because they're different. But what sort of nonsense is expelling them or getting rid of them? I mean, if I'm 41 years old now, if I start shouting at you and calling you queer and nasty names, I'm 41 years old, I'm educated, I know better, I have to answer to that. But children don't know any better, Peter. They talked about a child in Cornwall, a 6-year-old child who was expelled for using the word nigger. A terrible word, Peter, but he's 6. How can you expel a 6-year-old for that? Surely you say to the child, listen, let me explain to you the reason why that's a heinous word. Let's have a look down through history and why your black friend in your class is going to be upset by that. But expelling him, Peter, surely that's not right.
Well, exactly, and I suspect that the young 6-year-old didn't even know what the word actually meant. He probably picked it up from, adults or maybe other young kids and just said it, without realizing what it implied. So I think you're absolutely right. Education is the key. Expelling people, criminalizing people, that's not the way forward. It's much better to take that young person aside, to inform them and educate them about the issues, and to appeal to their conscience, to their good nature, which we all have a good nature.
Yeah.
And I think education. Schools are about education, and that includes education about issues like racism, homophobia, misogyny, and so on. That's the way we overcome these prejudices. It's by education.
Can I ask you a question on that, just before we briefly talk about Saudi Arabia? My colleague, David Icke, David has always said, and he's written for many years, about political correctness. And David believes there's a fine line between political correctness and between getting into the stages where you're actually becoming the SOAT police. Do you understand that, Peter, where that's coming from? Look, I won't tolerate anybody in my company being mocked or laughed at or made to feel uncomfortable because of who they are. I certainly won't do that. But there's also a fine line between that and between going over the top with political correctness, which some people feel is designed to control people's thoughts and to stop people speaking from the heart and saying what they really want to say. How do you speak to that? I know it's a very broad subject. What do you say?
Well, I think what is called political correctness is, in its intention, just the basic desire to be respectful towards other people, to treat others as you'd want them to treat you. So challenging racism or homophobia or any other kind of prejudice, we're doing it not because we want to drag someone down, but because we want to create a society where everyone feels included and welcome. And as I said, the way to challenge that is not by bans or prescriptions or criminalization or expulsions. It's by engaging with that person and informing them, educating them. And I think that it is important that we don't let prejudice, bigoted ideas pass. Doesn't mean that we have to be hostile and aggressive towards the person who says those things. The best way is to at least try to educate and inform them. When it comes to the whole issue of free speech, I am a great, great defender of free speech, even of people who are saying things that I may disagree with.
Yeah, you've always said that, yeah.
Free speech means nothing if it doesn't include the right of others to say things that you and I find disagreeable. If we start allowing a creeping censorship, the question is, where do we start and where do we end? Where do we draw the line? Now, I always draw the line at words or behavior that encourages or incites harassment, intimidation, threats, menaces, and in particular violence. But if someone is just being bigoted, lamentable though it is and important though it is to challenge them, I wouldn't want to see them prosecuted.
Fantastic.
Even if I totally disagree with what they're saying.
And you've said this so many times to me over the years. It's absolutely laudable. It's admirable.
It's like, for example, when some Christian or Muslim or Jewish leaders have said outrageously sexist or homophobic things, I have defended their right to say it, even though I've also disagreed with what they've said and challenged them. And I've opposed them being prosecuted because I think that is going beyond what is reasonable. In a free society, free speech is one of the most important, precious of all human rights, and there have to be really strong, compelling reasons to diminish it, and certainly very strong, compelling reasons for criminalization. So, for example, some of the Jamaican murder music singers, they were openly encouraging the killing of gays and lesbians. And I said, that is a red line. We can't allow that. No one should live in a climate of fear and threat and menace that's being promoted by these songs. But there were other Jamaican singers who weren't encouraging the killing of gays and lesbians. They were saying hateful, homophobic things. Now, I campaigned against them, but I never sought their prosecution, never sought to ban their concerts, because they hadn't crossed that red line of inciting violence or inciting threats, menaces, and harassment.
Absolutely right, Peter. Can't argue with that. Just before we wind up, we've got about 4 minutes to go. I wanted to spend a bit more time talking about Saudi Arabia. At the beginning of the programme, we heard from the family of a Palestinian journalist called Mohammed Al-Kek, who was arrested and thrown into prison by Israel, by the Shin Bet security service in Israel back in November for allegedly having Hamas links. But they're very... there's no evidence, and they basically haven't given him any sense or any idea that he might be put on trial. He's on hunger strike, and his situation is very, very dire in prison in Israel at the moment. It's dreadful there. There's that. But of course, the Saudi Arabian situation and what's happening in Yemen and the carpet bombing of Yemen and the murder of tens of thousands of Yemenis using weapons sold to the Saudis by Britain. Not to mention, of course, a couple of weeks ago, all of those human rights campaigners, those opposition groups to the Syrian regime, to the Saudi Arabian regime, just being put to death. It's a heinous situation, Peter. I know you're disgusted by it, and I know you're equally disgusted by the fact that this particular government, this particular Conservative government, refuses to condemn it in any way, shape or form.
Yeah, it was shocking the number of days that passed before David Cameron made any comment on the execution of those 14 Saudis by the regime in Riyadh. And even then, his criticism was very weak and very muted. Now, if Iran had been doing that, or Russia, he would have been out of the starting blocks like Usain Bolt, and condemning it in the strongest and most vociferous terms. So there's real double standards, and it's all down to the fact that the Conservatives, and to be honest, before them Labour, had a very cozy relationship with the Saudis. You know, we buy their oil, they buy our weapons. It's a sordid commercial relationship which has allowed profit-making to override human rights. And to me, just speaking personally, to me, human rights are the bottom line. They are fundamental, and that we have to be consistent. We can't give Saudi Arabia a free pass when we know that our government and other Western governments would never give a free pass to countries like Iran and Russia.
Or North Korea. You're absolutely right, Peter. I want to give out your website details. Pity we didn't get time to talk as much about that as I wanted, but we ran out of time, but that's okay. We'll get you back on again in the future. Peter, the best website to get you at is, of course, the Peter Tatchell Foundation website, which is petertatchellfoundation.org. Am I right?
That's right, and you can see a wide range of our campaigns there, and if any of your listeners are really enthusiastic, you can click on the Join Us button in the top right-hand corner, and you can receive our weekly email bulletins, which cover lots and lots of different diverse issues, many under the radar. So, for example, we published a couple of weeks ago a really heartbreaking first-hand account of an Iranian political prisoner, just explaining in his own words what happened to him, the terrible, terrible tortures he and others endured in prison in Iran. And that kind of first-hand eyewitness experience account is something you very rarely hear in the mainstream media.
Peter, great to chat with you. Look after yourself. I'm sure 2016 will be as successful for you as last year was. Thanks for coming on the programme, and we'll talk again soon.
And best wishes to all your listeners.
Marvellous, Peter. Bye for now. Peter Tatchell on the line to us there from his home in London.